why this anthology of Jewish Russian literature? Why this anthology? Why Jewish Russian literature? And why me? Well, perhaps I could start by telling you that ever since I remember myself being a conscious reader of literature, I've always been interested in dual cultural identities. In other words, not necessarily Jewish writers, who I believe are by nature bicultural, binational, or multicultural, but also writers in exile, writers working in more than one tradition or in more than one language. You probably know that my early work dealt with emigre writers and Vladimir Nabokov. In fact, Nabokov was the one who served as a kind of natural bridge between my earlier work on Russian emigre writers and my work on Jewish writers. So that's the beginning. And also, as you probably know, I myself am an emigre and a Russian Jew and come from a Jewish Russian literary family. So that biographical background certainly mattered to me because I feel that I have a personal connection to these texts. But now let me depart from the margins of the text and talk a little more about the anthology and this project. In some ways, this anthology tries to parse the poetics of Jewish literature, or as an experiment, by looking at a vast body of writings produced by Jewish writers living in what is broadly referred to Russia, not just Russia proper, but the lands that used to be part of the former Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, but also writers writing in the Russian language and living in exile. The common denominators is that these writers share some definitions of Jewishness, referring to their faith, to their cultural identity, to their shared history. And people still to this day debate whether there is such a thing as Jewish literature. And I felt that the material, the rich material provided by the 2 centuries of Jewish Russian creativity is one that yields itself naturally to such an experiment, trying to figure out whether we can arrive at a poetics of Jewish writing. I also wanted the material itself to suggest the criteria that would describe what it means to be a Jewish Russian writer. In other words, it's an experiment both simultaneously, I suppose, in trying to construct a canon and in trying to determine whether such a canon yields some sort of a unified poetics of Jewish literature. And of course, I guess I should point out that Russia is something of an extreme case for Jewish writing or for Jewish culture, because compared to, say, Western Europe or even Eastern Europe, for instance, Poland, the history of Jews in Russia is brief. The partitions of Poland, the end of the 18th century, early 19th century. It's basically the 19th and the 20th century, and the real explosion of Jewish Russian creativity doesn't begin until the turn of the 20th century, really, when Jews enter the Russian cultural mainstream. But the brevity of this time, of this span of Jewish Russian history, I think is compensated for, and for a cultural historian it's particularly important, by the turbulence, by the intensity of both the historical events that shape the writings of Russia's Jews, and by the contribution that Jews of Russia make to the Russian cultural mainstream. So in other words, this anthology seeks to accomplish a number of things, among those, because it's an anthology in translation. And this really interests me, or used to interest me, because I feel that I now have some results to report. If Jewish poetics is truly a thing that has to do with more than one language, that is astride a number of cultures, then it ought to survive in translation. And in fact, translation is something of a litmus test here. If texts produced by Russian Jews in the Russian language, which for some of them was their first language, for some was a close second language acquired, if these texts survive in translation and still read in such a way that the reader experiences not only the themes, the ideas, but also what I like to call the texture of Jewish writing, then I think indeed one could claim that there is a Jewish poetics, there is Jewish literature, and that Jewish Russian literature is one of its richest, most extreme examples. Extreme positively, obviously, rich, extreme, but in a way outgoing, departing, because I think the time of Jewish Russian history might be in its last days. I really wanted the anthology to be representative, to be fairly exhaustive, although of course the only anthology that is exhaustive is the complete canon. And I think eventually the electronic means will allow that. But since this is an anthology that comes out in book form and that also doubles as a cultural history, I felt that, well, the number of choices had to be finite. The initial shape of the anthology was actually half the size of what you see now. It was to be a single volume, one featuring about 70 writers. And then about 6 years ago, when I had done the initial research, I really felt that that wasn't going to do justice to the 2 centuries of Jewish Russian creativity, and we doubled the size and the span of the anthology. And actually, I was very fortunate to have Emmy Sharp as a publisher, because they were so receptive in today's conditions of the literary market. It's unusual to be so fortunate. But basically, there are 132 writers represented here. I wanted the anthology to tell a more or less complete story from the dawn of Jewish Russian creativity in the early decades of the 19th century up until the very end of the 20th century. The exact span is 1801 to 2001. And as you know, the subtitle is 2 centuries of dual identity in poetry and prose. So that suggests that in representing Jewish Russian creativity in this anthology, I also wanted to tell as complete as possible a story of how these writers remain Jewish while also becoming culturally Russian. The dual identity was one of my guiding principles. Well, then I must have looked through, in some detail, through works by over 300 writers of some significance, and part of the challenge was also to represent as many artistic and literary trends, particularly during the modernist years, early Soviet avant-garde, very experimental forms and traditions, but also to represent the more formally traditional and conservative writings. I also wanted to feature geographical diversity, and so in the end it came to a certain division where about every 20 years of history, and there are convenient historical divides that served as beginnings or endings of given sections, say 1917, right, or the 2 Russian revolutions, or 1953, the death of Stalin, or 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so I tried very hard to achieve also some numerical distribution so that no part would be overrepresented. But how you go about this? Representational principles do not always mesh very well with ideas of literary perfection, literary quality, and with value judgments. So of course, I had to be discerning in such a way as to make certain parts represent adequately the extent of Jewish creativity. For instance, the first explosion during the Russian Silver Age. This is a time when a number of first caliber Jewish writers enter the Russian mainstream, like Mandelstam, for instance, about whom no one had to make any apologetic remarks, that they are, although they're Jews, they are important Russian writers. These are major Russian writers, and they are also Jewish artists. Or the period following the October Revolution in the early Soviet decades, when thousands of Jews enter the Soviet mainstream, and hundreds of Jews become Russian artists, taking advantage of the temporary, of obviously the Euro equality that the Jews are granted following the February Revolution. It's a platitude to state that the contribution that Jews have made to Russian literature is enormous and is beyond comparison. Let's go past such platitudes and attempt to assess it, both looking back and looking ahead. Looking back, it would certainly appear that what perhaps my anthology sums up is a history of Jewish Russian creativity that is very closely, intimately married to the mainstream history of Russian culture, and yet distinct from it in the sense that these writers, no matter what their cultural, religious aspirations, no matter how some of them may have tried to assimilate, to abnegate their Jewishness, or no matter how others, say, for instance, the great Zionist Vladimir Zev Zhabotinsky, who was a militant Zionist and a passionate Russian writer and translator. There's a variety of ways in which these writers conceived of their relationship to Jewishness and to Russianness. But what seems true is that this is a record of such a contribution without which the history of Russian culture would be vastly incomplete, and indeed, does this anthology fill a gap? I'm not sure. It certainly fills a gap in the way we understand Jewish literature, and particularly because it's in translation, it will make this body of literature accessible to readers the world over. But I think rather than filling a gap, it suggests what gaps, what gaping holes there would be without these writers in the history of Russian culture. I say this with a measure of pride, but also with sadness, because there's reason to believe, and at least the latter part of my anthology, called in PostSoviet Times, which is the most tentative one, which covers the post-Soviet decade, and what's going on in Russia today, seem to suggest that the story of Jewish Russian creativity, this great marriage, may be coming to an end. In that sense, one of the things that I was most fearful of when I worked on this anthology is that it was becoming a kind of necropolis. That is to say, it was becoming a monument to a dying culture. In fact, someone recently referred to it as a matseva, a Jewish gravestone. I hope it's not quite the case, in the sense that cultures survive not necessarily in their living, active life, but also in cultural memory. And that's why, to me, the fact that this is coming out in my adopted country and in my adopted language, in English translation in America, to me this is inspiring, because I think these texts will survive, will endure, whether in the cultural memory of grateful or ungrateful Russians, or in the cultural memory of Jewish readers the world over. But texts do survive, and cultural histories may correct themselves in all sorts of different ways. Obviously, any anthology is also a record of the one who is anthologizing, of the one who is choosing the text, and mine is not free of such biases. But I do think that when you consider the magnitude, the numbers, the sheer number of these writers, their contributions, and try to think of them apart from Russian culture, you really fail. It's not apart. It is both separately and together, but distinctly so, self-consciously so, very often. At least in retrospect, it sure appears that way. And so, can you think of Russian literature without its Jewish contributors? You would have to be an extremist, both as a cultural thinker and as a political fascist to attempt to tell a story of Russian culture without its many Jewish contributors. Well, I suppose one could say that there was something of a compensatory mechanism for me as an exile and as a Jewish Russian author and as a student of Jewish Russian literature living away from Russia, something of a compensatory gesture in putting together this anthology, because I think it bridges and transcends distance and time, if indeed this anthology is to stay in print and live as a memorial, a living memorial to these writers. That said, of course, it was very challenging to get hold of some of these texts. The research took a lot of time, partly because I told myself that I wanted to cover exhaustively this tradition, and for instance, for any text that I used, I looked at as many variants that I was familiar with, both in some cases printed and unpublished, and I've had to work with archives and libraries abroad, but believe it or not, a great deal of the materials were made available to me through our own interlibrary loan at the O'Neill Library at Boston College. And as I write in the acknowledgments, really without this wonderful group of colleagues, a lot of what I did would have remained just blank pages. They really helped me with such dedication. And for the years that I was conducting the research, I was probably getting weekly packages, and some of the texts that were obtained for me by the colleagues at Interlibrary Loan are extremely rare, say are available at only one library in St. Petersburg. And in that sense, I really felt that they were my colleagues and co-contributors to this anthology. So in other words, these distances can be overcome, I think, if you believe, and I can't help but believe that, because I think only one has to be a little bit of an idealist to work on something like this for so long. I worked on this for 8 years. Imagine, I started working on this before I was married, and the anthology came out soon after the birth of my daughter, who's now 13 months. So basically, I feel like a whole life separates me from the time when I first conceived of it and the time when I had finished correcting the last batch of proofs. So the distance is manifold, but I think it is the presence of the library, this library, and other libraries in the world, and the idealism of these librarians that enabled me to complete this project. Our ambition was to use as many newly commissioned translations for this anthology, and I don't have the exact number, but I would say somewhere about 90% of the translations are all new translations that were done specifically for this project. And there are a number of reasons, and partly it has to do with the fact that I was really interested in working with a team of translators who would work for this project, whose translations I would work with as an editor, who would be edited the same way, of whose translations the same expectations would be made, and it was challenging. It took many years, but I think the translations are excellent. I was so fortunate to have this team of translators working, and I myself did some of the translations. Some of the translations that we used had to be used for reasons having to do with copyright, or there were some translations that have become classics, like the translations of Nadezhda Mandelstam's memoirs, that it would have been, I think, a little awkward not to have used them, or as the excerpts from Dr. Zhivago. But the main reason why, from the very beginning, we felt that new translations were necessary is because most of these works had not been available in any English translations at all. So in that sense, we had no choice but to commission these translations to, in a way, make sure that these texts gain a new life in English translation. Again, I'm also a practicing translator, and I teach literary translation. I'm very interested in this. To me, it was really an experience that I know I will never do an anthology like this again. It was beyond comparison because I felt that I was witnessing and participating in one fashion or another, as an editor, as an advisor, as a collaborator, co-translator, in the birth or rebirth of a whole culture. And I hope the readers who are reading this anthology are as pleased with these translations as I have been. I think, in general, the simplest, bluntest response to the question about who I see as the readers for this anthology, I think any lover of literature will appreciate it, because there's so much there in different genres, in different traditions, in different forms, dealing with different subject matters, that one doesn't necessarily need to be a student of literature or a student of Jewish culture and history to find something rewarding in such a volume, in such 2 volumes for that matter. So I really hope that this anthology will gain a large audience in the English language, but more specifically, of course, students of things Jewish, both in the formal sense and in the informal sense. I hope that synagogues and various Jewish educational institutions will think of this book as one that is part of their library. Historians and students of Russia, I think, stand to benefit from this work, in the sense that it is not just an anthology but a cultural history. Students of comparative literature, and broadly speaking, and this is in a way to end with, on the same note that I started on, that students and readers who are interested in various multiple identities, immigrants, exiles, bilinguals, writers who are never at home in one place but at home all over the world, writers who never feel that they can achieve the status quo. In fact, I think no writer should feel that he or she can achieve the status quo. So in that sense, surely it probes something that in some respects is narrow, Jewish Russian literature, but at the same time it probes something that is very wide and broad and all-inclusive. And so I really hope, I truly hope that this anthology serves as an invitation to other scholars and students to enter into dialogue with me and with these Jewish writers. I think they're there waiting to be discovered, some of them clamoring to be discovered, say 200 years too late, but it's never too late to discover a writer. And I really hope, not just because you know, so much work has gone into this project, but because I love these writers, and many of them I love dearly. I hope that the book remains in print and that it has a long life in the English language.